What a tangled web we weave when we practice to deceive. That, my friends, is a great way to sum up episode 4 of Penny Dreadful City of Angels. This episode, entitled Josephina and the Holy Spirit, is just filled with multi layers of subplots, uh, brutal violence, underhanded lies, and manipulation. Episode 4 opens up in Ensenada, Mexico, with a group of LA gangsters with their Tommy guns mow down a village of residents. This savage slaying has dire consequences as the stray bullets hit an innocent young girl who was savagely killed in this gangster warfare. As the Saint Santa Morta looks on, if you know from episode 1, she cannot intervene. The only thing she can do is take the innocent people to heaven who has been slain or who believe in her. After savage killings, you see Santa Morta carry the young child into her arms and presumably escorting her to heaven. Also, keep in mind, like any good storytelling, this opening sequence, which soon cuts to a different scene, will have a reason for its part in the series. Like I mentioned, like any good storytelling, you'll have this scene not necessarily repeats itself, but become a topic of conversation later on in the episode. Now, back in Los Angeles, we see Detective Vega going to work at the LAPD precinct, and he is upset and wondering why were they rounding up all these Latino youth for no apparent reason. And I'll tell you what the reason is that if you remember in episode 1, the Hazlitt murder case was trying to be pinned on the Mexican American community. There was a lot of political pressure going on at this time for that murder to be resolved as quickly as possible. And one of the techniques was a typical Gestapo technique in rounding up individuals, working them over, beating them up, trying to get a confession from them. And what you'll see in the next scene is Detective Vega confronting no other than Officer Riley, doing what he does best. So here we see Detective Vega confronting Officer Riley as he's beating up this kid that was tied up and trying to force a confession for the Hazlitt case. And of course, as you can see here, if I zoom in, he's handcuffed to the chair so he couldn't defend himself as Officer Riley beats him to a pulp, again, trying to force a confession. So after the chief comes in and breaks up Detective Vega and Police Officer Riley, we come across and go to City Hall, where Councilman Townsend, sit right in the head of the table, is discussing demolishing Belvedere Heights. It's a fictional name for Highland Park, and to create the Arroyo Seco Parkway and the 110 freeway. Now, if you see on the corner left, the older woman, is her character name is Beverly Beck. She is basically Councilman Townsend arch nemesis. She realizes that he's just not a good apple. You know, he's not a good seed. And she has no plans to help Councilman in this destruction of a community. And what we're going to find out eventually is that she has proposed with other members of the city council to go around Arroyo Seco to some of the hillsides where at the time there was no homes and there was no residents living in the homes, whether it was a camping structure or or shantytown homes. There were vacant mountaintops that could cut across and get them to exactly where they wanted to go, which was Pasadena. But true to character, Councilman Townsend has no interest in any alternative plans. His purpose for doing the highway and the construction of the motorway down Arroyo Seco was to displace the community that lived there, essentially trying to push them out of the city. So here's a look at the alternative plan by Councilwoman Beck. Now, if you look closely, you'll see Glendale, Pasadena, Griffith Park, Lincoln Park. But for whatever reason, they chose to call Highland Park Belvedere Heights. And you could see the Arroyo Seco Parkway go right through Highland Park. And Beck spoke to some transportation engineers, and that red line was basically an alternative route to go to Pasadena that wouldn't obstruct or destroy the homes in Belvedere Heights. So another storyline here is the infiltration of the Nazis, obviously in Los Angeles, and that concerns some of the members of the Jewish community. Here we have Detective Vega's partner, Detective Louis Michener, who he himself is of Jewish descent or an American Jew. And he's discussing with one of his cohorts what happened in the previous episode where the Nazi operatives gunned down Detective Michener's friends who were actually trailing them, trying to find out what they were up to. And through this discussion with her, he's trying to find a way to get his revenge. He knows that being an LAPD officer, he can't seek revenge or retribution. So he's proposing that he reach out to a fictional gangster in this episode called Benny Berman. Briefly, I did some research, and it turns out Benny Berman is an irate Israeli singer. So I don't know if the writers or the producers, that was one of their favorite singers growing up. I'm not sure. But he's supposed to represent the Jewish gangster, the gangster that was kind of in charge of that area in which they reside. And it turns out that that particular gangster, Benny Berman, which I'll show you in a minute, is none other than Brad Garrett, who's playing the Jewish mobster, Benny Berman. Now, in the conversation he's having with Detective Michener, he's kind of a little upset that he's trying to get him to do his dirty work. You know, Brad Garrett's character, Benny Berman, basically is ostracized by the Jewish community for being a gangster. And so he doesn't like that for opportunities of taking revenge or murdering someone, then he's someone they can deal with, but otherwise they basically ostracize them, don't want nothing to do with them. So at the end of the scene, Benny Berman, Brad Garrett, doesn't give Mitchell an answer and just takes off. He's, like I said, upset. He makes his points and leaves. And then we cut away, speaking of Nazis, to pediatrician Peter Kraft. So here's Peter Kraft and his fellow Nazis at a birthday party, supposedly for his son Tommy. And if you remember previous episodes, as Elsa, who is also Magda, who is also Rio, and who is also Alex, is a seductress, plays kind of the damsel in distress, the German immigrant, who's trying to seduce him for obvious reasons. She's the devil woman, and she's trying to infiltrate him as well. And so you see here he's looking on because Elsa and Peter Kraft's wife, Linda, played by Piper Perabo, is actually looking on. And he's actually looking on and seeing them interact with